All right, Aaron. So in the realm of speed and power, and when we look at how that applies to performance, I think there's some questions around like two things we'll talk about, and they're going to see in their programs: COD, change of direction, and agility.
Yep.
So there are differences between speed and power programming.
Yep.
As it relates to change of direction and agility. And I think like people think of like, oh, agility, yeah, that's like the speed ladder, right? Right. I know you're laughing about it, but like people are on the other end and go, wait, that's not agility training?
Yeah.
Like what is agility training? What is change of direction training? What is speed and power training? So maybe we start with just defining kind of those terms.
Yep.
Because we talked a lot about speed and power and kind of how that applies.
Yep.
But now we're going to get into the nuance and the details. So,
So I overarching call this just movement. So just being an athlete is movement.
Yeah, let's not overcomplicate that.
Yeah, we just keep it super simple of like, hey, here's your movement training for the day. We're not going to call it speed and power, agility, whatever. We want to get all into the nuances of it. But so change of direction and agility are usually lumped together into one thing, but they're two different sides of the coin. So yes, they are dynamic movements, but one requires a partner or a shot timer. The other one is just working on skills. So
yeah, let's break that down.
Yep.
So, but before we break it down, like where does this show up for the population that we're training, which is primarily law enforcement officers, right? So why would this be important for them before we get into the like, how do we train it and what are the differences?
So agility is something they're going to experience on the job because they have to react quickly to a sound, threat call, any sort of thing that happens on the job, you have to react. And so agility training is where there's a reaction involved, where you're changing direction based off of reaction.
Okay.
Change of direction is more of the controlled knowns. You know where you're going to go. And so you're going to go left and then you got to bounce back right. And so that's where the two different separators are, is you know where the course of fire, you know the course you're going to run in a change of direction drill. Versus agility, you don't know where you're going to go or when you're going to stop.
So that's a very easy, simple way to think about this.
Yep. Reaction versus known.
Gotcha. Yep. Okay. So so that's a really good definition of kind of separating the two. Like, all right, so how do we do this? Like, how do we train this?
So step one in any sort of movement is learning how to land and decelerate. And so for the progression of getting to where you can change direction based off a reaction at a high level, you have to learn how to stop first. You have to learn how to land in a good athletic position to where you're not crushing your body and putting too much pressure on certain spots that don't need that pressure and those forces. So
yeah. So what's the consequence of that if you don't have that ability?
Well, you can get away with it a few times, but eventually over time, if that's all you're doing it with poor form, you're going to wear your joints down. You're going to start experiencing tendonitis, muscle pain that are just easily fixable with just good technique.
So I know across the board, maybe you know the answer to this, maybe you don't. I don't know. I know this in certain sports. Like what is the number one like non-contact injury that like a law enforcement officer, maybe specifically like a
law enforcement?
Yeah.
Hamstrings.
Okay. So non-contact.
Non-contact.
So that's not a wrestling match. It's not a combative situation. It's
sprains and strains overall is the number one most common acute injury. So something that happens on the job, something that it just happens because of the job. You're not dealing with it chronically. Yeah.
So I think if you get into other sports or other quote unquote athletes, you know, if we're starting looking at, again, defining the law enforcement officer as an athlete at some level, you know, one of the big ones is like an ACL or a knee problem, but an ACL, that's one of the most common non-contact injuries in a lot of areas.
It's very common, yeah.
And that doesn't happen from sprinting.
That happens from poor change of direction.
Change of direction. So it's something as simple as stepping off a curb, not realizing, right? Stepping back onto an uneven surface or down. Again, skiing, it's not the skiing down the hill that's blowing out the ACL. It's the very fast, abrupt stop,
right?
You know, or entanglement that you know the skis have got in or whatever. And that might sound super, super simple, but it is this force application in outside forces that are not from another human. They're your own in gravity, earth, the terrain, and the environments you happen to be in. So
another one I hear is Achilles.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. So I mean, if we're going to talk about three big injuries right there, two of them can be dealt or are from change of direction a lot of the time.
And so it's just going back, sorry, I jumped in there to talk about like where it shows up for somebody in terms of a consequence. I know you're going to get into this, but and part of this will be like, well, how do you like in terms of how do you train it? How do you prepare the body for it? So let's go back to. Sorry, I cut you off. Let's go back to like how do you train this with regard to the change of direction stuff.
So again, step one is learning how to decelerate and land. So how to absorb those forces properly with great mechanics, and then you can step into the how do you produce force again. And so step one is just I'm stopping. I'm going to a known direction and I'm stopping. So deceleration and change of direction are also two different things. So you have to learn how to get into a good position before you can explode out of that position. And
so the entry and the exit.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. So that's where the power work comes in. So being able to produce force into the ground and explode it out and express that power is where it comes in. So you decelerate and then you're training power also. And then you bring the two together with change of direction, which could be something simple as I'm going to run 5 yards to my left, stick my foot in the ground, and I'm going to sprint out 10 yards. And just being able to eccentrically load and then concentrically contract and explode out the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think if people want to think about this, like, where do you see this? You see this on Instagram all the time. It
definitely is the most, of all the movement, it's definitely the most attractive on Instagram.
Yeah, because it's sexy.
Yep.
Right. And so I was talking with Jake earlier about this. Like people, we were talking about the courses and how they overlap with the programming, the human performance programming piece, and how limited the time is that you can spend with somebody on their human performance piece in like a 2 or 3 day course. And they're understanding like, oh, I see what I need to be doing to be in a better position. And I understand this concept of entry and exit and, preloading and unloading and things like that. Right. But now how do I train this? Right. Now, how do I, okay, so I get that. And I'm trying really hard here, Aaron. But how do I move like Jake is doing it? Or how do I move like you're doing it? And I think that's what you're talking about. This doesn't just fucking happen because you're thinking about doing it hard.
No, right? Going to Jake as an example, he's been doing this since he was 3 years old.
Yep.
He's been an athlete his whole life. He's trained it. And so his genetics is also a piece of it. But he's maintained that skill throughout his entire life.
Right. So he's maintained what he had, which the foundations are the ability to decelerate, the ability to stabilize, right? So that you can then produce force. So you're reducing the force in those two things to then reproduce force going back the other direction. So there's not something that just happens.
No, you have to work step by step. They're all skills. So don't think of it just as an exercise. I'm going to be good at the 5-10-5 shuttle. You got to get good at the skills involved to be able to express all those abilities in the actual exercise. So you got to be able to decelerate. You got to be able to produce power. And then you got to be able to do that in a dynamic motion.
Yeah, so then there's some foundational stuff there, some very basic foundational things there, starting and rooted in strength. Like you have to have.
And then you have to have the strength to be able to control your body weight down and then reproduce it.
You can get some of that by doing that activity or training that activity, but then that just goes back to like, what are the movement patterns under load that we do that are more controlled under repetition? Going to the gym, the squatting, the hinging, the lunging.
Yeah, it all plays together. It's like a giant Venn diagram, but like there's like 500 circles.
Exactly. So we brought up the Venn diagram actually earlier. Another thing. So this will be familiar. Okay, so that's sort of change of direction, kind of at a base level. Let's talk agility. So the agility is the unknown piece.
The unknown.
How do you train that?
So it's a good evaluation tool. So if you want to go out and you want to fix somebody and see what they need to work on, you could do an agility drill to see how they respond to those situations of, hey, me and you are going to go out here. I need you to sprint towards me. And when I drop the foam roller, you're going to stop on the dime. Or if I give you a left-right call, you're going to sprint left or right. And so it's a good assessment tool of like, what do you need to work on? Because it exposes you immediately. It
exposes you to the reaction, but it also changes to your ability to change directions, decelerate, stabilize, produce power. Right, gotcha.
So how you train it is, again, you got to start with the change direction first. You got to be able to decelerate. You got to be able to produce power. You got to be able to produce those in a change of direction drill, a variety of them, whether it be in the sagittal plane, frontal plane, even rotation with the transverse plane. And then you got to be able to transfer it over to having a partner who can tell you, or even a shot timer, and react off of those pieces.
And so that reaction, there's things that play into the reaction stuff. Like what could we be using to train that agility and that reaction time? So you mentioned shot timers, so that's audible.
That's an audible. You can give and that's something you can use on your own. But even then you start getting to, I know I may remove left because you have to pick something in your mind to be able to react to. You just don't know when it's going to happen. So you can set a random shot timer, start it, take off running, and then maybe your drill is to break left, make an L shape. So you start it as soon as you hit the beep, then you know I have to decelerate and then sprint to another spot. And then you can get even more complex where you have a partner and you could do visual or verbal cues telling you left or right or lighten up a target or something like that. And based off of that, sprint forward, left, break left. But you know there's an option that I can go right. So you have that piece in your mind that's kind of holding off. Being able to react to both of those is it's always an option for you. So it's very different versus I know where I'm going and I'm reacting off of just a sound.
So I think this is like, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but this is like this argument that we hear like gunfighting is, or USPSA is not gunfighting. No, it isn't. It isn't.
It's a skill.
You're practicing certain skills, but there's a known. You know where you have to go, right? Versus in this other environment, like you don't know what's about to happen.
Yeah.
You have to react to it, right? But the things that you're doing, say, in a stage, do apply to the things that you would be doing in that environment. But the missing piece is the unknowns, right? The unknowns. And so
I think saying USPSA, and this could be a controversial topic.
Oh, people are going to be so pissed that I even brought that up.
Saying USPSA is not gunfighting is like saying running routes on air is not football.
Boom.
Like, yeah, you're not running against somebody who's going to be pushing you, trying to push you down, or you may not actually be able to get your perfect step, but you're still training a movement pattern and you're getting reps on reps and you're building a certain skill that is useful for later on down the road when you're actually in a game.
So to maybe continue to connect some dots there, the change of direction is being applied, generally speaking, a lot in a stage of, say, like a USPSA match. The agility, however, happens when you trip, right?
Yep.
Or you slip, right? On that loose surface. Like
even that's just a simple reaction. Yep. You trip over a stick, your foot has to catch, right? And then you have to recover. It's something that's unknown, but you have to just go with it.
Right. We're talking about like lower body stuff right now, but things that happen with the upper body, like you fumble your magazine. That's agility, right? And
there's agility involved with it. Yeah, it's a fast reaction.
Your body's awareness in space and how you are able to reconnect that, all that stuff together when that stuff happens. So agility happens in a match on accident, whereas the change of direction is happening very, very purposefully. And you're thinking about how that's going to happen as you go through there. So you are training that in that sense. But the next thing I want to get to is how do we train that in our programs? Like how has that been programmed in?
So it is typically on Wednesday for our performance program. It changes whenever we get into the specialty programs, the static evergreen programs, just because how it lines up with certain lifts. It's very eccentric heavy, especially early on as we're progressing. So it's heavy on the legs. So we don't want to couple it with a leg day as you're trying to learn that skill. And then you got to go and try to lift legs after. It's just setting you up for failure.
I'm chuckling about it, but we look at this programming sometimes and we hear what people are telling us. I'm like, where did this come from? Like, how did this happen? It's like somebody just chose a bunch of exercises and tried to fit them into something, through the week versus...
You go through that early on as a coach, as you're starting early out in the program and you're like, oh, okay, I know my athletes need this, but I got to fit it all somewhere.
Cram it in.
And then it's like, you just start putting like what you think is important. And then it's like, oh, I have a slot here. Let's just throw something in there. And so it doesn't flow correctly. So it's taken, I've been doing this 10 years now. It's taken 10 years to get to this point of like how a session should flow.
That's an art.
It is an art. Yeah. It's been a big process of trying to make it attractive for the masses, practical, time efficient, and then also what's going to give them what they need.
Yeah, those are all things that you can't read in a textbook.
No.
Right? It comes through experience, trials, and failures, and then ultimately like this understanding the nuance and the gray areas of things and where you can adjust a little bit here to get, again, give the minimum effective dose to get the maximal result with all the things that we're trying to do on a regular basis through the strength, through the speed and power, through the capacity, and on the balancing of all the other things one of these professionals has to do in life. So, again, like having it set out for you to not have to worry about it and be able to trust that, look, there's a lot of thought and experience and failure that's gone into coming to what this looks like. I think all I want people to do is walk away from listening to this podcast going, okay, I haven't thought about it that way. These guys clearly have, right? We've chuckled about a few things. Hopefully that doesn't offend people like, oh shit, like my program
it's not that we think anybody's an idiot. It's just if you don't know what you don't know.
And why would you know all of this?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure somebody's going to hear something, a strength coach or somebody's going to hear something that I've said on some of these podcasts and laugh a little bit. And it could be just, I don't know what I don't know.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so educate me.
Yeah.
If you're a professional, you're seeking constant growth.
So to be clear, just in kind of wrapping this up, people are going to find the change of direction training, right, inside all the programming that we provide.
In the programming, it's going to be in the middle of the week, intentionally set to couple with how the rest of the week flows and the lifts that you're doing that you need throughout the week.
To provide you the performance adaptation, the recovery you need in order to maximize the work that you're putting in, again, the adaptation. Also manage a couple of very specific things, which we really haven't gotten into depth with. I'm sure we can later, which is both the neurological adaptation, neuromuscular adaptation, if you want to put it that way, and the metabolic adaptations that we need to be paying attention to through this programming to set somebody up for success in the long term, understanding that we're not preparing for some certain event. This isn't designed around some thing that we've concocted in our head, imaginary
we're not making like the worst scenario possible and then programming around that. It's just overall readiness and building athleticism.
Yeah, so it's everywhere. Now, again, just really quickly, I asked this question, like, where is the agility programmed into this?
There is very, very, very minimal agility because I can't control what you do.
So it's like the Olympic lifting that we talked about on the other podcast about Olympic lifting. We talked about the snatch and the clean and jerk. Like, how much of that is in there?
Yeah.
Well, we've thought about that to how much should be in there in terms of how much are we trying to do that isn't going to give us the impact, the effects in the little time that we have to do it in, while somebody's just trying to figure out a skill when they're not getting a training adaptation because they're just trying to figure out the skill. And is the risk to reward makes sense? We understand most people aren't going to be training with somebody else.
Yeah, you don't know. You may not have a partner. Some people may not even have a shot timer.
Right.
Depending on, there's a wide variety of people we have. Hopefully, a lot of law enforcement guys have and gals have a shot timer, but again, I can't account for everything and every little detail. If they have questions on like, hey, how can I add agility to this? I feel like I'm getting to the point where like I'm confident in my ability to change direction. Is there anything? Yeah, reach out. Maybe we can add it. I can give a few drills that you can add in.
So last thing to think about, hopefully people listening to this can kind of walk away from this and they can answer this question or they'll have this question now. When I look at a program from wherever it's coming from, whatever I might be currently doing, or they're thinking about purchasing one, or they've been involved in programs in the past, and that program specifically talks about this is going to improve your agility, think about what you heard here. Like, is it really? Or what we're really talking about is change of direction? Because you just explained that very specifically and went into depth on it. Those are two very different things. Very different things. They are not the same. So somebody's saying something is agility when it's really not. That's a flag. That is a red flag. You should be aware of that. You should have questions about it and feel free to ask those questions of whoever is saying that. Number one. Number two, how much agility, if there is any, is programmed into your program or should be programmed into your program? Well, I think you just built a case for it should be very little.
Yeah, there's a practicality piece that has to be considered.
For that reason. So like if you're expecting to see a bunch of agility work in an IEP program, sorry to disappoint you, but we're just going to set the expectation right now. It isn't practical, so we haven't given it to you. Like we understand the limitations of time that you have, right? And the real application of what you can do, what you probably should be doing that transfers over into performance, longevity, or readiness and longevity, and an agility, while important and is an awesome thing to train. Probably not going to see a lot of it here, so don't expect that. Maybe sometime down the line we can provide some things for people.
That could be something later on down the road, a group of drills or something like that. But yeah, if you're training the fundamentals of change of direction, it'll be a lot easier to transfer it over to the agility piece. So you have to have a strong foundation on just about anything. This is that strong foundation that transfers over to agility.
Perfect.